Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into some serious strategy. Today, we're cracking open Carl von Clausewitz's On War.
Still the go-to guide for military minds, even after all these years.
Absolutely. And we're tackling a chapter that's all about getting that edge. Chapter 24 of Book 6, Operating Against a Flank.
Clausewitz at his best, trust me.
Now, before we get too far, we know you're already serving our country, and while we haven't worn the uniform ourselves...
We're both students of military history.
Exactly. And we're here to break down this chapter and see what makes it tick, even centuries later.
Because some things in warfare, they never really change, do they?
That's the idea. So let's talk strategic flank. Clausewitz isn't just talking about flanking maneuvers on a battlefield here, right?
No, he's thinking much bigger picture. Think entire theaters of war.
Whoa, okay, so zoom out on the map, then what?
Think about everything the enemy needs to wage war effectively, and where those things are vulnerable. Supply lines, communication routes, escape routes, even their home front, those are all strategic flanks.
So it's about hitting them where it hurts, but not necessarily in the most obvious place.
Exactly. It's about putting yourself in their shoes, anticipating their next move, and then figuring out how to disrupt it.
Got it. So how do you exploit a strategic flank? Clausewitz talks about two main objectives, right?
He does. First up, disrupting communications.
Makes sense. Cut off the head. The body can't fight.
Right. You hit their supply lines, their reinforcements, their ability to coordinate. Suddenly, they're fighting blind, cut off, more likely to retreat.
Can you give us an example? From history, I mean.
Sure. Clausewitz uses Dawn in 1758. Instead of directly attacking Frederick the Great, he targeted his supply lines during the siege of Olmütz.
Bold move.
It worked. Forced Frederick to retreat without a single direct attack on his main force.
Wow. Proof that sometimes the indirect approach is the most effective.
Exactly. And then you have the Russian campaigns of 1812, Napoleon's forces harassed by smaller, more mobile Russian units.
They were constantly on the back foot.
Exactly, disrupting their movements, messing with their logistics. This wasn't just about physical disruption, though.
It was psychological warfare, too.
You got it. Imagine the impact on morale, on their ability to plan and make decisions under that kind of pressure.
I can imagine. Makes you think twice about those little everyday distractions that throw us off our game.
For sure. But here's the thing. Clausewitz is clear that just being on the enemy's flank isn't enough. There are conditions for success.
Oh, so it's not as simple as it sounds.
Not at all. One factor is the size of your flanking force. Can't be so big it weakens your main effort.
Right, you don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul.
Exactly. Then there's the enemy's situation. Are they already on the ropes?
Like a boxer on the ropes, just one good punch away from going down.
Precisely. Or are they fresh and dug in? Timing is everything.
And what about their supply lines themselves?
Of course. Longer, more exposed routes are easier to hit. You don't want to be chasing shadows.
And finally, time. These operations aren't instant wins, are they?
Nope, they take time to have their full effect. More like a siege than a blitzkrieg.
So you're playing a long game. Wearing them down, chipping away at their morale.
You got it. And all of this, Clausewitz says, is influenced by geography.
The terrain itself.
Absolutely. The lay of the land, the communication routes, even whether you're operating in friendly or hostile territory, it all plays a role.
So you have to know the chessboard as well as, the opponent's pieces.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And speaking of key players, Clausewitz was big on the importance of good leadership, especially for those flanking detachments.
The ones sneaking behind enemy lines, causing chaos.
Those are the ones, he says, those leaders, they need to be resourceful, bold, able to make decisions on the fly with limited communication.
Talk about a high-pressure job.
Right. They were like the special forces of their day, operating deep behind enemy lines, often with little support.
A small force in the right place at the right time. That could change everything, couldn't it?
Absolutely. Clausewitz recognized that. But he also understood that a direct assault on the enemy's rear is a high-risk, high-reward move. Sometimes a more subtle approach is needed.
Strategic maneuvering.
You got it. It's less about brute force and more about pressure and harassment, using your position to force the enemy to retreat without a major battle.
Okay, so less head-on collision, more like
Yeah.
a game of cat and mouse.
Exactly. And for a prime example of that, look no further than Frederick the Great in the Silesian Wars.
He was a master of outmaneuvering his opponents. But we've talked about disrupting communications, maneuvering. What about actually cutting off the enemy's retreat? That seems incredibly risky, dividing your forces like that.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart. Clausewitz knew that. But there are situations where he believed it could be the winning move.
Like when?
Well, for one, when your forces are already geographically separated, so a quick concentration isn't possible. Think Frederick the Great in Bohemia in 1757.
Caught between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. Or when you have such overwhelming numerical superiority that a bold move is worth the risk. Like the Allies against Napoleon in 1813.
Strength in numbers.
Sometimes that's all it takes. And then there's the scenario where the enemy overextends themselves, leaving themselves vulnerable.
Napoleon in Russia. Classic example.
Right. Long supply lines, brutal conditions. The Russians saw their chance and took it.
High risk, high reward.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how these principles from centuries ago still resonate today.
That's what we're here to unpack, right? And I think that's where your experience, your insights as someone in the military today come in. You know, it's amazing how Clausewitz, writing back in the 19th century, understood that warfare is about so much more than just raw power.
Right. It's about strategy, cunning, knowing how to apply pressure at just the right moment.
Exactly. And he talks about this idea of a demonstration as a way to exploit the flank. It's fascinating stuff.
What's that exactly? Is that like a feint?
You got it. Remember we were talking about the risk of dividing your forces to attack the enemy's rear? A demonstration is a way to create that threat, or at least the illusion of it, without actually committing all your resources.
Okay, so you're messing with their heads a bit, making them think you're about to pull a fast one.
Exactly. It's about sowing chaos and uncertainty. They might overreact, divert troops to counter this perceived threat, and weaken their main force elsewhere. Or they might hesitate, giving you the time you need to make your real move.
So it's a mind game as much as anything.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that Clausewitz says this doesn't even have to be based on a realistic threat. If the enemy is already on edge, even a bluff can be incredibly effective.
But isn't that playing with fire a bit? What if they call your bluff? Then what?
There's always a risk, for sure. A demonstration that's too obvious, too over the top, will be ignored. And if they see through it and counterattack, you're in trouble. It requires careful planning, impeccable timing, really understanding your opponent's psychology.
You have to know how to push their buttons without setting them off.
Exactly. And when you think about it, this concept of a demonstration is still very relevant today, even with all our advanced technology. The fog of war hasn't disappeared, has it?
Not at all. If anything, it feels like it's gotten thicker in some ways. Makes you think about disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks designed to mislead.
Exactly. Those are all playing on the same psychological principles that Clausewitz identified back then.
Creating that confusion, that sense of not knowing what's real and what's not.
You got it. And that's what makes Clausewitz so relevant even now. The tools of warfare might change, but those underlying principles, the psychology of conflict, that's timeless.
That's a great point. But how much can you really learn from military history? Don't things change too much to make those old lessons relevant?
It's a question Clausewitz grappled with himself, actually. He was very aware that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to warfare. He even criticizes those armchair generals who throw around terms like flanking and turning without really understanding the context of the situation.
So it's not enough to just know the jargon.
Not at all. It's easy to get lost in the theoretical side of war, but you always have to remember the human element. Morale, political climate, even the weather. It can all influence the course of a battle.
Like that saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Exactly. You have to be adaptable, ready to adjust on the fly. And I think that's something you understand well being in the military. It's not just about memorizing tactics from a textbook. It's about knowing how to apply those principles to the ever-changing reality on the ground.
Absolutely. So how do we bring all this together? How can someone listening to this, someone with real-world experience on the front lines, actually use these ideas from Clausewitz to make a difference?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's what we'll explore as we wrap up this deep dive.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with Clausewitz, from strategic flanks to demonstrations. Now, the big question, how does all this translate to the modern battlefield? For those in the fight right now facing 21st century challenges.
That's what it all boils down to, right? How do you take these principles that are centuries old and apply them to a world of cyber warfare, drone strikes, things Clausewitz could never have imagined?
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole almost.
Yeah, it's a challenge. Let's take the idea of the strategic flank itself. Is it still a physical space, a geographical location in the 21st century?
Or is it something more abstract now?
Exactly. Disrupting networks, cutting off information flows, crippling financial systems, that could be the modern-day flanking maneuver. What would Clausewitz say about a cyber attack, for example?
Oh, interesting. Would that be a form of disrupting communications like we were talking about earlier?
I think so, absolutely. Imagine shutting down an enemy's communication network right before a major offensive. No bombs, no bullets, but the impact could be even greater than blowing up a bridge or a supply depot.
It's like you're taking away their eyes and ears, their ability to coordinate and react.
Precisely. It makes you wonder if some of Clausewitz's ideas are even more relevant now, in an age where information is power.
I think you might be onto something. And what about those daring detachment leaders Clausewitz was so fond of? The ones operating behind enemy lines, causing havoc. Isn't that kind of independent thinking, that adaptability, even more important for special forces today?
Absolutely. Think about the kind of situations they face, the split-second decisions they have to make with limited information. Those are qualities that are more valuable than ever in modern warfare. And it's not just about tactics and technology either, right? Remember Clausewitz's emphasis on understanding your enemy's psychology.
Right, getting inside their heads.
Exactly. That's more critical than ever in an age of asymmetric warfare. You're often not facing another nation state with clearly defined objectives, but groups with different ideologies, different motivations.
So how do you fight an enemy that doesn't play by the same rules?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can't just outgun them or outmaneuver them. You have to understand their beliefs, their vulnerabilities, their pressure points. It's a different kind of chess game.
It's almost like you have to get inside their heads, right? Figure out what makes them tick.
You got it. And that's where those timeless principles from Clausewitz come in. Strategic thinking, adaptability, knowing your enemy better than they know themselves.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners, especially those serving in uniform? What do we want them to walk away with today?
Clausewitz himself said it best. Military history is not meant to be memorized, but to nourish the mind. Don't just study past battles, study the thinking behind those battles. What were those commanders thinking? What were their options, their constraints? And how can those lessons be applied to the challenges you face today?
Don't just be a student of history, be a student of strategy.
Exactly. And remember, no two situations are the same. What worked for Napoleon might not work in cyberspace. Learn from the past, absolutely. But don't be afraid to innovate, to challenge assumptions, and find your own way to apply these timeless principles.
So keep Clausewitz in your back pocket, but don't be afraid to write your own playbook as you go. That's a wrap on this deep dive into Carl von Clausewitz's Operating Against a Flank. We'll be back next time with another fascinating piece of military strategy. Until then, stay sharp.